newspaper, or book, or pamphlet, or handbill that you read, that I am a patriot and a traitor, a great general and a cowardly private, an elegant writer and a simpleton who cannot spell words of more than 2 syllables, a democratic autocrat, an urbane savage. In other words, I am Andrew Jackson. Now, I'm sure you all know that I have other names. I am called Old Hickory by my friends and enemies, and I have many of them. I am called Sharp Knife by the Choctaw, and I am called a son of a bitch by John Ross, Cherokee Chief. That last name I return to sender tenfold. But with all these contradictory elements, how is it that Andrew Jackson doesn't fly apart like a boiler under too much pressure? Well, it may be that Old Hickory is stronger stuff than any of you can imagine. And believe me, that strong hickory was needed during my administration. Of all the vicissitudes that visited during my administration, slaying the hydra of the Bank of the United States and defeating the moneyed interest therein, enforcing the Tariff Act of 1828, even though my administration had nothing to do with it, facing down the nullification crisis in South Carolina led by John C. Calhoun. Oh, my friends, I have regrets on that score. But of all these things, it is doubtless the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that generated the most vitriol, the most contention, the most contradictory remarks and reactions and strategies, both for and against yours truly. The act itself was submitted by my administration in December of 1829 to the Congress. And by May of the following year, 1830, they had passed it. And in December of that year, December of 1830, I made the following remarks to the joint session of the Senate and House, the same body that had passed the measure earlier. It gives me pleasure to announce to the Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching a happy consummation. 2 important tribes have accepted the provision made for their removal at the last session of Congress, and it is believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes to avail themselves of the same obvious advantages. The consequences of a speedy removal will be important to the United States, to the individual states, and to the Indians themselves. The pecuniary advantages which it promises to the government are the least of its recommendations. It puts an end to all possible danger of collision between the authorities of the federal government, the state government, and the Indians themselves. It will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of country now occupied by a few savage hunters. By opening the whole territory between Tennessee on the north and Louisiana on the south to the settlement of whites, it will incalculably strengthen the southwestern frontier and render the adjacent states strong enough to repel any future invasions without remote aid from the federal city in Washington. It will relieve the whole state of Mississippi and the western part of Alabama of Indian occupancy and avail those states of the ability to advance rapidly in population, wealth, and power. It will separate the Indians from immediate contact with the settlements of whites, free them from the power of the states that they wish to have no part of. The present policy of the government is but a continuation of the same progressive policies of previous administrations, albeit in milder form. The tribes which occupied the countries now constituting the eastern states were annihilated or have melted away because of white settlement. The waves of population and civilization are rolling westward. And we now propose to acquire the countries occupied by the red men of the South and West by a fair exchange at the expense of the United States, to send them to land where their existence may be prolonged and perhaps perpetuated. Doubtless, it will be painful for them to leave the graves of their fathers. But what do they more than we did with our ancestors, and that our children do now? To better their condition in an unknown land, our forefathers left all that was dear in earthly objects. Our children by thousands yearly leave the land of their birth to seek homes in distant regions. Does humanity weep at these painful separations from everything that the youthful heart, both animate and inanimate, has grown attached to? Far from it. Far from it. It is rather a source of joy that our country affords scope where our young people may range unconstrained in body and mind, developing the power and facilities of man in their highest perfection. These children of ours remove hundreds and almost thousands of miles at their own expense, purchase lands they occupy, support themselves at their new homes from the moment of arrival. So can it be cruel in this government when, by events which this government cannot control, the Indian is made discontented in his ancient home? For us to purchase his lands, to give him a new and extensive territory, to pay the expense of his removal, and support him an entire year in his new abode. How many thousands of our young people would gladly embrace the opportunity of removing west on such conditions? If the offers made to the Indians were extended to our children, they would be hailed with gratitude and joy. And is it supposed that the wandering savage has a stronger attachment to his home than the settled, civilized Christian? Is it more afflicting to him to leave the graves of his father than it is to our brothers and children? Rightly considered, the policy of the general government toward the red man is not only liberal, but generous. He is unwilling to submit to the laws of the states and mingle their population. To save him from this alternative, or perhaps from utter annihilation, the general government kindly offers him a new home and proposes to pay the whole expense of his removal and settlement. How is that iniquity? How is that tyranny? I don't speak rhetorically, ma'am. How is it? Excellent. How is it? Exactly. Now, this act that we've spoken so much of, it is an exceedingly simple thing for any of you who've ever seen an actual bill passed by Congress or the Senate. They're usually not just 2 pages. 2 pages, 7 sections. An act to provide for exchange of lands with the Indians residing in any of the states or territories and for their removal west of the river Mississippi. I draw your attention to the word exchange. An act to provide for an exchange. Implicit, inherent in the word exchange is that both parties freely enter into the agreement. There was no coercion on the part of the federal government in the negotiations of these treaties. None. We'll talk later. I've marked it. We'll talk later. We'll talk later. 7 sections. But let's enumerate them briefly. Section 1, that the President of the United States and the executive branch be empowered to make a survey of lands west of the Mississippi held in public charge. Section 2, that such lands so surveyed can be, by the authority of the President of the United States and his administration, exchanged with Indian nations for their lands of equal area east of the Mississippi. Section 3, that the United States government will forever guarantee in surety their possession of those lands so long as the tribe or nation does not abandon the land or go extinct, in which circumstances the land reverts back to the United States. Section 4, improvements of added value upon the land, such as houses, pigsties, chicken coops, grist mills. Any improvement upon the land will be evaluated, and the tribes will be given fair value for any improvements made upon the land they are exchanging. Section 5, the federal government will pay all removal expenses and all subsistence and living expenses on the new lands for every tribe member for the first year of residence thereon. Section 6, the new nations are to be protected in their new lands by the federal authority from any encroachment or attack by other Indian nations or by any person whatsoever. That clause was put in because of the state of Georgia. Georgia deserves a special place somewhere. And finally, that the federal authority will have the same superintendents and same negotiating powers with the tribes as they had east of the Mississippi. Once again, the Georgia influence is there. Are you getting the drift that perhaps they didn't respect the boundaries and thought they could set the boundaries instead of the federal government? And as head of the federal government, how do you think I might react to that? So that is the act. The speech I gave before Congress, the rationale behind it. How did this turn out in application? The tribes of the Northeast were virtually gone by the time this act was made. Chippewa, the Ottawa, and one other whose name escapes me at the moment, were the only ones affected. They were incredibly small tribes, easily accessed and acquiesced for movement. It is the 5 tribes of the southeastern area of our country that were most affected. And in order of their treaties, the Choctaw, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, Chickasaw, the Treaty of Pontac Creek, the Creek, the Treaty of Cassetta, the Seminole, now and again with the Treaty of Payne's Landing, and the one that I know you are all most familiar with, courtesy of John Ross. Say it, Matt. Now, what's the name of the treaty? What's the name of the treaty? The Treaty of New Echota. The Treaty of New Echota with the Cherokee. Those are the 5 in order. All had the same basics in provision. All treaties exchanged at least the same amount of land east for west. The Choctaw, being savvy negotiators, got more than they had. All got their compensation for value-added structures. All had their expenses of removal and transportation and subsistence paid. Some administered it very well. Others, John Ross, failed to administer it utterly. More of him in a moment. Also, in each treaty, there was provision for any member of those nations or tribes who wished to stay in their home state to do so. None was forced to leave. However, if they wish to stay, they must become a United States citizen and give up any claim to lands west of the Mississippi. Upon becoming a United States citizen, they would receive a cash allotment and acres of land. All tribe treaties had all these provisions, and yet John Ross claims he was forced on a death march. Let us look at the marches of each tribe. The Choctaw removed first and earliest, having procured the best land. They removed in 3 waves. Their first wave had hundreds of deaths from cholera. Guess how many deaths there were in the United States total from cholera that year, and in Europe that year? Thousands! There was a cholera epidemic going on in the entire continent and in Europe. But please, put those deaths at the feet of my administration. Because surely I control pestilence. Because I am the God of death and war. The second two wings of the Choctaw removed with no deaths. The Chickasaw negotiated a very interesting treaty. They eschewed the government paying for their removal and their expenses, got a higher lump sum settlement, bought their own land from the Choctaw, because the Choctaw had the best land, and removed themselves with no deaths. The Creek, upon signing their treaty, some of them had what might be termed cold feet, and there was an incipient rebellion, but troops were sent in and calmed it down, and the small number of Creek that were there were removed in good order with no deaths on the journey. The Seminole are a special case. Their internal divisions rivaled that of the Cherokee, perhaps exceeded them, but the Seminole internal divisions led to bloodshed among themselves before removal even occurred. Several chiefs signed a treaty of plain signing saying they would move, then had a change of heart, then changed heart back, and then Osceola murdered 2 or 3 of them, and the rest of them fell in line to his way of thinking, and the Seminole War continues to simmer. And finally, we come to the Treaty of New Echota. Negotiated in December of 1835, the Cherokee National Council had full representation at New Echota. To be sure, the entire population of the Cherokee were not there to vote on the matter, because that's not how representative democracy works. It was never intended for the entire population of the Cherokee to assemble. Do we have the entire population of the United States assembled in Washington, D.C. every time there is a law to be passed? The answer is no, we do not. And yet, John Ross holds it up that because majority, the population could not credibly be said to be represented at New Echota, that the treaty wasn't valid. How would he know? He wasn't there. The designated chief was not there to do his duty for his people. If he wished to speak out against the treaty party faction, he should have been there to do so. And this party faction, the treaty party faction, who are they? John Ridge, brilliant, up-and-coming politician, his cousin, Elias Boudinot, and the great man himself, John's father, the Ridge. That was his name. He was simply called the Ridge because he was like a mountain when he fell upon his enemies, and he was enduring as a mountain in his negotiations. Now, he did acquire a nickname of some sort when he fought with me in the campaigns against the Creek in 1813 and 14. He became known as Major Ridge. And when Major Ridge attended the Cherokee National Council, he bore more weight and had more authority and more gravitas than any other man in the Cherokee Nation. And Major Ridge affixed his approval to the Treaty of New Echota. If that doesn't mean it's legally binding, then nothing is legally binding. And so what follows on? John Ridge, Major Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and their parties assembled to be granted a minority of Cherokee citizens and did lead them to their new lands without any deaths. The majority of the Cherokee stayed behind because John Ross, who is a honey-tongued orator, I will give him that, assured the people, assured the Cherokee, I will make sure this removal act is rescinded. And then when that patent impossibility failed to materialize, I, John Ross, will delay removal for our people. I will delay it 5 years. And when that didn't happen, I will delay it 2 years. And when that didn't happen, I will delay it 1 year. And when that didn't happen, it was too late! The deadline for removal had come, and John Ross was piddling his time and his tribe's life away in useless negotiations in Washington, D.C. And this, my country, is the only time you can say that federal bayonets pushed a Cherokee anywhere. It was time for removal. Nothing was going to stop this. I wasn't in office. That's how successful the delays Ross had been. Federal bayonets did indeed move the Cherokee to staging areas and staging grounds. Stockades were built as temporary residences while wagons and provisions were being procured. And it was at this juncture, weeks and weeks past the ideal time to start the journey, that Ross shows up, waving the piece of paper granting him the authority to be in charge of transportation, lodging, and removal. What a brilliant victory. The same thing that was already in the treaty. As I said, they were already weeks and weeks behind schedule. But also in that paper was the authority for John Ross to award the contract for supplying transportation and food to the Cherokee on their journey. And he gave the contract to his brother. That wasn't nepotism. That was just the Indian way. We whites don't understand that. Bullshit. John Ross delayed removal. John Ross deceived his people. John Ross gave the contract to his brother, who did not know how to organize such a venture. John Ross caused them to leave late in the year and travel in the worst parts of the winter. Cherokee died on the journey, but you may not lay their death at the feet of Andrew Jackson. You may lay them at the feet of John Ross. So now, I am more than happy to discuss this issue with anyone who'd like to.
What role, if any, did the federal judiciary play in the challenges to the act?
There were no challenges to the act. Literally none. What you're probably thinking of are a couple of court cases that originated in Georgia, a land populated extensively by hillbillies and the illiterate. There were two cases. One versus the United States and one versus the state of Georgia, both brought by the Cherokee or agents of their goodwill. The Worcester case and the other. Those cases were both about who had authority to deal with the Indian nations. They weren't about the Indian Removal Act at all. Both cases were specifically about Georgia usurping federal authority to do what it wanted to do with the Cherokee lands and nation. Now, I believe after our speech this evening, you have some idea of how I react to people challenging my authority. So how do you think we reacted with these Georgians? Well, the cases wound their way through court. The first case, Mr. Marshall simply set aside. No verdict was rendered at all. The second case in Worcester versus Georgia, where Georgia had illegally imprisoned a missionary of all things. Georgia. The case went up and Mr. Marshall ruled that, of course, Georgia had no authority to detain this man, no authority to say who could and could not go on Cherokee lands. That decision is reserved for the federal government and the Cherokee themselves. So, Worcester versus Georgia was a victory for me. It reaffirmed federal authority, and yet I have heard some people bandy about, perhaps this fellow down here bandies this about, that, when the decision was rendered, Andrew Jackson said, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. Why on earth would I say that? There was nothing to enforce, and the decision agreed with me. I was not against the decision. It reinforced federal authority over the state in negotiating and dealing with the Native Americans. There was nothing to enforce. It was existing policy. So that's the answer to your question, sir.
If you could go back and change anything about the whole process, what would you change?
There is exactly one thing I would change that happened during my administration. There are two things involved in that one thing. I would shoot Henry Clay and hang John C. Calhoun. There are a lot of things, though, about tonight that I was really hoping we would get into, and we did. And one of those is that Worcester versus Georgia case. If Glenn and I have talked about this so many times, if we can just get you through this series of programs to realize that it's not what the popular imagination thinks. It was not about the Indian Removal Act. It was specifically about Georgia thinking it had authority to usurp the federal government. That's what it was. And the only reason Jackson didn't come down harder on Georgia is because he was busy smashing John C. Calhoun in South Carolina down over the nullification crisis. You have to look at all of these things in conjunction. There are a lot of things going on at the same time as the Removal Act. Jackson, and I'll give him some empathy on this, his dilemma in 34, 35, 36 is, okay, which state do I go to war against? South Carolina or Georgia? It's going to be one of them. So there's so many, like to use today's phrase, so many balls in the air in that time period. That while I certainly never grew to like Jackson, I certainly appreciated the man who was an adept political maneuverer. And I will say this, his relationship with his wife Rachel, he fell in love one time, loved her till she died, fought a duel to defend her honor, carried the bullet in his chest for 40 years. If that's not love. By the way, killed the other guy. Even though the fact that I don't like him, there's something about the man that you kind of go, okay. You kind of have to take him on his own terms. You want to talk about American original. In a lot of ways, now Lincoln is my boy. I love me some Lincoln. He's my favorite president. He's probably my favorite human outside of my family in all of time in existence. But it's often said that Lincoln is an American original. And I think those two presidents, in many ways, are the American archetypes. In many ways, at their best, and for Jackson, sometimes at their worst. But it's interesting to have played both characters. And there was a special urgency for me tonight to make sure I got Jackson right. Probably because I don't like him. I was like, well, then I've really got to get him right. But he's due his own merit. He really is. And that's kind of a feeling that I had that I only rarely get with these people. I mean, I always want to do a good job, but sometimes, like with Lincoln, it's just the sheer poetry of the man's soul is amazing. And with Jackson, just the sheer audacity of his existence is kind of amazing.